Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Garrett Okrasinski and I'm a project director on the social responsibility team at Fishwise, and I will be facilitating the presentation today. Fishwise is a nonprofit consultancy with a mission to sustain ocean ecosystems and the people who depend on them by transforming global seafood supply chains. This webinar is the sixth and final in a series of capacity building webinars hosted by Sea Alliance in collaboration with Global Tuna Alliance, World Benchmarking Alliance, and Fishwise. Today, we will be discussing purchasing practices and incentivizing positive change. This webinar is being recorded. Participants' audio and video functions are disabled, but we do encourage you to engage via the chat and submit questions using the Q&A feature. And if you have a technical issue, please send us a message and we will try to help sort it out. So as I mentioned, this is the final webinar in a series. If you haven't caught the previous webinars, please check them out at the Sea Alliance website. We will drop a link in the chat so you can have access to that. But over the course of the series, we've discussed topics that include responsible recruitment, worker engagement, and the most recent webinar was on decent work at sea. We will drop those recommendations from the last webinar on decent work so that you can have those for reference. Those will be in the chat. This series has been really well received, and to date we've had over 500 views. So if you know of someone that could benefit from concise guidance on human rights due diligence implementation, please consider sharing this series with them. On the next slide, you'll see we've had the opportunity to learn and hear from over 17 experts to discuss human rights due diligence guidance and implementation. We've actually had so many great speakers, I couldn't fit them all on a slide, but you'll see the next slide that each speaker brings forward resources, tools, and lessons learned from the organizations they represent. This includes the ILO, Environmental Justice Foundation, Oxfam, as well as Better Buying, who we'll hear from today, and leading businesses who are willing to share their experiences with others. We have and will continue to share resources to help you with human rights due diligence implementation. Following each webinar, we create a concise one-page document that has the links that we share throughout this. So please keep your eyes out for those as we share them. In these webinars, we've had a few core recommendations throughout. Adopting these recommendations will make human rights due diligence more effective and representative of your company's impact. So as a reminder of what we've been sharing, human rights due diligence should be proactive and iterative. It should engage workers and stakeholders throughout the process. Companies should support worker representation and organizations where possible and not try to create a parallel system. A key part of human rights due diligence is remedy, and companies are responsible for access to remedy. And finally, through advocating and supporting ratifications of international agreements, you can help create a system that supports and upholds workers' rights. As the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct mentions, it's not just the role of sustainability or ethical sourcing teams. It requires buy-in, operational support, and systems to bring in teams across a company to uphold rights. So envision you're implementing human rights due diligence, you have a strong commitment, you're proactively taking steps to identify and assess impacts, you're engaging with stakeholders, and you're integrating and acting on those findings. You're tracking effectiveness and communicating your performance, and you're learning throughout the process, constantly iterating and improving. But important here is that human rights due diligence is a process, and to work effectively and meet your company's commitments, actions must be backed up by how your company purchases. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So on the agenda, first off, we're going to start at the top with the recommendations that we'll be unpacking over the course of the webinar. Then we're going to hear from Better Buying on their principles for responsible purchasing. And later, we'll also hear from Prince's group on how they're evaluating their operations and looking at purchasing practices. And then we'll review some actions you can take immediately following this webinar. And then finally, as this is the last webinar in the series, we'll conclude with comments from Andy Hickman, the head of Sea Alliance, to discuss how this work will move forward. Before this webinar, we did send out a brief survey, and thank you to those that were able to respond. And to help ground this conversation where companies are currently at, I just want to take a second to review some of the responses. So generally speaking, customers are not prioritizing human rights as a part of their procurement process. I say not yet. The second is majority of respondents are either starting, do not, or maybe are unsure of the training that the procurement teams receive on human rights. And then the majority do not have human rights as a part of their senior commercial representative's role. So it seems that we still have a ways to go to bring these two teams together so that they're working more efficiently and effectively together. So to help companies prioritize efforts, I want to highlight 4 recommendations at the top. Like I mentioned, we will be unpacking these over the course of the webinar. So the first is work with leadership to get responsible sourcing embedded in procurement processes. So how does this become a part of the leadership's and procurement team's role? The second is assess purchasing practices. Identify what pressures your companies are responsible for that could impact suppliers and put pressures on workers. The third, provide training and upskilling for directors and procurement team. And then finally, share about your work so that you can keep procurement team in the loop of possible impacts. First, why are we focusing on purchasing practices? So poor purchasing practices can have unintended consequences. As the Human Rights Watch have found, things like low purchasing practices, short lead times, poor forecasting, or payment terms can increase risk of abuse. If purchasing practices aren't examined, it can undermine a company's ability to meet their commitment. If suppliers continue to get squeezed, some try to look for opportunities to cut costs in ways that could increase risk for workers. If purchasing practices and ethical sourcing teams are not working together, it will remain an uphill battle to make improvements throughout the supply chain. In a report named Towards EU Mandatory Due Diligence Legislation, Perspectives from Business, Public Sector, Academia, and Civil Society, quote, as a part of the obligation to cease, prevent, mitigate, companies would need to amend purchasing practices throughout the procurement cycle from early stages, so sourcing and product development, to their interactions with suppliers in price negotiations, confirming technical standards, contractual terms, payment terms, and lead times. Finally, companies should develop new mandates for purchasing teams, which allow them to balance price and ethical considerations. That's why our first recommendation is to work with leadership to get responsible sourcing embedded in the procurement process. With emerging human rights due diligence laws, companies' own operations are in scope, which means procurement needs to be addressed. So we recommend to work with leadership to get human rights into procurement scope, incorporate into their role and job description, KPIs, and how their performance is assessed. Second, work with leadership to get a clear commitment that is followed up by process. For example, if we have a commitment to responsible recruitment, these are the questions you need to ask when engaging with a supplier, and this is the process that you need to follow if an issue is found. A part of this work is to work with procurement from the beginning to incorporate into their existing process and share key findings from your due diligence efforts. Make this a feedback loop for both teams. So for example, what processes exist for supplier vetting? How can they be strengthened? How and when is the best time to bring in responsible resourcing? And at what point are there key decisions being made? Another consideration is to embed human rights in supplier selection and process. Ensure it's a key element of a supplier scorecard. And finally, work with leadership so that procurement knows that the executive team backs them up and supports their decisions when they are made to align with their human rights commitment. For our second recommendation, assess purchasing practices, I want to introduce Dr. Marsha Dickson. She is a president and co-founder of Better Buying Institute. She's an award-winning scholar who during her academic career gained wide recognition on global academic leadership for her research, teaching, practical engagement with global suppliers, retailers and brands, and sustainability groups. She's conducted research on social responsibility in numerous countries around the world. Dr. Dickson is also Irma Ayers Professor Emerita at the University of Delaware. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We're excited to learn from you.
Thank you, Garrett. Thanks for having me. And it's exciting to be talking to this industry. Let's go ahead and shift to the next slide, if we will. Back in 2003, I first heard the term purchasing practices, and it was connected with non-compliance to codes for workplace conditions. It was a big turning point in my life because the focus of my work for many years as a university professor then after, with my teaching, with my researching, with consulting, and even working on policy with multi-stakeholder organizations, we focused on that. We focused on purchasing practices. And now as co-founder and president of a nonprofit organization that's scaling that research and education about purchasing practices. So this is my thing. I've been looking at this for a very long time. And, back when 2003 turned and this topic came up, the early research and reports coming out about purchasing practices. And by purchasing practice, I'm meaning the day-to-day business practices, business actions and decisions buyers carry out with their suppliers to get product to market. So that early research was showing that really why we weren't making progress on improving things like long working hours, wage and wage payment practices, use of migrant and temporary labor, unsafe working conditions. And many of these are sometimes referred to as persistent forms of non-compliance because despite efforts to get suppliers to fix them, non-compliance continues. So, and some leading apparel brands and retailers that I was interacting with at that time and who had started to investigate what was happening were finding that anywhere from 50 to 76%, company told me, of the non-compliances in their factories could be traced back to their own business action supplier. That's a big, big impact of purchasing practices on the conditions of work. So now 20 years later, because there were still companies that said, but we're not sure of these connections, Better Buying has compiled available information that I'd been collecting on that connection between purchasing practices and factory level noncompliance for years. And we've confirmed those many, many connections. The largest number of confirmed impacts of purchasing practices are on working time, contracts in HR, and compensation, with evidence of impacts on health and safety and others as well. And this slide depicts an image of a report you can find on our website about that purchasing practices and noncompliance. While our evidence relates primarily to the consumer goods sector and specific industries where Better Buying has the most experience, like apparel and footwear, household products, toys, electronics, and others, the similarity of challenges faced in your industry, a large migrant workforce, forced labor, debt bondage, withholding wages, hazardous working conditions, long working hours, and what appears to be a lot of price pressure are the same ones in the industry we've been looking at to date. So if suppliers aren't provided information about the work that's coming, if the work is highly seasonal with peaks of activity, if they're not given time to work or paid fairly, what can we expect besides these persistent poor working conditions? So my question to you is, purchasing practices of retailers, brands, suppliers, and even processors have the greatest impact on the various entities they contract with? And it's probably different depending on the business relationship within your supply chains, whether it is between the retailer and the brand and the supplier and the processor and producer. There are probably different pressures at every level along the supply chain. of the day-to-day actions of those entities operating as buyers, wherever they are along the seafood supply chain, create human rights risks in those supply chains. And what are you going to do to change those practices? Let's go to the next slide. And we need to get to work on this. Human rights due diligence legislation, as Garrett has mentioned, is being enacted in many parts of the world, and the eyes of legislative and other stakeholders are on the seafood industry. It's apparently been identified as a high-risk industry. Legislation wisely recognizes that due diligence just involve looking up the upstream supply chain and forcing those terrible suppliers to do things better. The legislation includes identifying risks that a company's own operations create and then addressing those so that negative impacts are prevented in the future. So let's go to slide 3. You can act now and begin earning the benefits, or you can delay and take the risks. So taking action allows you to be ahead of the legislative curve and be ready to identify, to improve, track whether changes you are making in your purchasing practices are paying off in terms of continuous improvement, and also reap the business benefits that come with more collaborative supply chain partnerships and more resilient supply chains, because the link between business benefits, financial sustainability, and social sustainability as it comes to purchasing practices is very, very strong. And it's really, the basis of good business. And together with your suppliers, you can have better business as well as better outcomes for workers. So I'd rather be on the action side of this chart than the inaction side, and risk paying fines, having divestment from investors, and just continuing bad business that devalues your brand and your supply chain relationships and creates disruptions in supply. We'll go to the next slide. The seafood industry is a new one for Better Buying, but our vision and mission is really industry neutral. Our vision is to see buyers and suppliers working together with responsible purchasing practices so that both can achieve their financial, social, and environmental sustainability goals. And so that's, buyers and suppliers throughout the supply chain. To achieve this big goal, we support buyers in treating suppliers as trusted and respected partners whose insights are critical to building resilient supply chains and bettering working conditions. A big part of our work involves providing data to buyers so that they can assess the impact of their actions by where to improvement, and then watch the benefit and improvements that are monitored and see that the work that they're doing is effective and having impact that you want. However, getting data from suppliers about their buyers' purchasing practices is hard because retaliation and harm to the business relationship. And I'm sorry, I think I saw my internet was unstable for a minute, so hopefully you got that. So our mission also involves supporting suppliers with a safe place. We are basically providing supplier voice to you. We provide them with a safe space so they're confident in providing feedback and co-creating solutions to these shared business challenges. In slide 5, the next slide, provide an overview of what Better Buying does. We are the only authentic, independent voice of the supplier, and data is at the heart of our work. Some of you may have integrated worker voice systems into your programs. We are the supplier voice. We collect data from suppliers about their specific buyers' purchasing practices. I'm not talking about a person, I'm talking about the company, but they fill out a survey related to a particular company and how that business plays out. Our flagship survey is a deep dive into several key practices, and it's called the Better Buying Purchasing Practices Index. And the second survey provides a higher level of assessment of risk. It's called the Better Buying Partnership Index. And all of our reports for companies come with benchmark data so that you can compare how you're performing against the broader industry. And that's really powerful and motivating for change in your company. Each survey plays a part, along with our e-learning course, in helping companies achieve Better Buying's 5 principles of responsible purchasing. And then we our ongoing research as needed with microsurveys and roundtables that give us a more detailed understanding of certain problems and suppliers' ideas for solving them. And our surveys maintain the confidentiality of suppliers and present their feedback in aggregate so they can be completely honest and truthful without jeopardizing their business relationships, without fearing retaliation from buyers. So we're really excited about the possibility of adapting these tools for use in our industry so that we can support you in carrying out the necessary human rights risk assessment. And this will allow each buyer to understand the unique pressures it's putting on its suppliers and start working collaboratively within your companies and with your suppliers to find new ways of working. And this will also give you evidence to report on and demonstrate how progress in your own operations is paving the way for better conditions for workers. So it's really a good solution to the human rights due diligence and the increased inquiries you would be expecting to get from investors and other entities about purchasing practices. So we go to the next slide. I believe Better Buying's 5 principles of responsible purchasing apply to the seafood industry as well as to the sector. The issues for so much the same as we see in our work with consumer goods. Wouldn't the impacts on workers be reduced if buyers in your industry provided enough visibility for their suppliers to plan and carry out their business operation? If buyers provided stable business around the year, if buyers provided enough time for all processes to be completed, if buyers' financial practices with suppliers were fair, and if buyers played their part in improving and environmental sustainability. Those are the 5 principles. And I'm pretty sure the answer is yes, that these 5 principles can be the guiding principles for responsible purchasing practices in the seafood industry. And we'd like to work with you to fine tune our tools so that they can address the most impactful purchasing practices in your industry, and then help you get to work assessing with what each company can do to be a better buyer and a better business partner for your suppliers so that suppliers can do what's right for workers. And I think we go to the closing slide, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I hope you have lots of questions for me later.
Thank you, Marsha. That's wonderful, very exciting, and it's so great to hear that that feedback loop that is so needed from the supplier to better understand how the process can be improved. So looking forward, and thank you for staying on for the question and answer. So as mentioned, we also need the directors and procurement to have the direct impact and help reduce the risk and promote decent work. However, additional training and upskilling should be provided for directors and procurement teams so that they can meet that. Upskilling and training is needed so that they can be ready and confident, but also consistent in their response to how they're working with suppliers. Consistency in responses is key to meet companies' commitment and ease those business relationships, as there are clear requirements to meet. Again, another activity here is to identify existing training opportunities and processes and embed opportunities to upskill employees. While there may be turnover, it's also important to consider how you work to ensure resources and training are accessible to new hires and included in the onboarding process. As we know, the nuances and consideration of seafood can be complex. Work to simplify it where possible when you're working with those teams, while also focusing on known high-risk behaviors and steps procurement teams can take or things they need to consider in their daily work. I also, wanted to just take a moment here to say Fishwise can help with this. We've given many trainings to new teams to bring them up to speed on the seafood landscape and the special considerations they need to be aware of. We also have created the Roadmap for Improving Seafood Ethics, or RISE, that has these e-learns that are digestible trainings for seafood and human rights. It's like a 101 level. And then we can create custom presentations based on your supply chain operations and sourcing trends. So, please reach out if you would like support with the seafood landscape. Our fourth and final recommendation is to keep the procurement teams in the loop. These are interconnected efforts. So human rights due diligence and purchasing teams are and should be interconnected efforts. As we work to adapt and incorporate ethical sourcing into purchasing operations, more you need to build strong relationships by understanding and listening to the procurement teams. They are, the eyes and ears that work with suppliers, and understand what pressures they are under and what challenges they're seeing when they're engaging with suppliers. This will help you be more effective in your job. Second, it's important to proactively communicate with them about the human rights due diligence process and what that looks like and how it could impact sourcing. For example, could it slow something down? Could a high-risk supplier be taken out of the sourcing matrix, maybe? Or when to communicate, you've identified a risk through stakeholder engagement and how you might be looking to change your approach. And when there are these big decisions to make, bring in procurement, understand the context and impacts. But I think really important here is to bring in leadership for those hard calls. This will demonstrate how the commitments are being actioned and upheld throughout the business. So with that, we're going to have a short video. We will have Paul Williams from Prince Group discuss their work and what successes they are seeing. This was pre-recorded. Andy was able to catch up with him. So.
Hi there, everyone. I'm really glad for this bit of the webinar to be joined by Paul Williams, Head of Environmental and Social Sustainability at Princes. And Paul has kindly agreed to give us some time to talk specifically about the topic of purchasing practices. And I've got a few questions for Paul, but we can keep this as conversational as we can. So first of all, Paul, thank you so much for joining us. And I was wondering if you could give us some background on why and how Princes has focused on procurement in its work on ethical trade.
Hi, Andy. Great. Thanks very much for the opportunity to share some insights. I guess in terms of procurement, I very much see the business sees at Princes that procurement is at the heart of the solution on probably all of the sustainability topics. So whether that is focusing on net zero goals, whether that's reducing our carbon footprint, whether that's about improving human rights due diligence within the value chain, everything comes back to the leverage and to the relationship that we have within our supply base. Because fundamentally, my view is they hold the purse strings, they hold the leverage, and they've got the real insights in terms of how we can deal with some of the challenges. And also, I think supply partners that we work with, they're the ones that live and breathe lots of the challenges, the opportunities on a day-to-day basis. So they can come to us with innovation, with ideas, and also approaches to add value to procurement and supply chain challenges.
Really useful. Thanks, Paul. And I just wondered, have you seen examples where procurement practices have been shown to have negative impacts on human rights in the supply chain?
We have. I mean, Princes produces over 3,500 different food and drink products. We source from over 2,000 direct suppliers across a number of different commodities and brands that people are familiar with, hopefully. We have seen examples where, I guess, not through a malicious intent, but where historical approaches to procurement have led to impacts in squeezing in supply chain practices. So a great example is the use of e-auctions, electronic auctions, which were used to tender for some commodities back in probably 5-10 years ago, tomatoes being one example. And actually what that did is it focused very much on cost alone, rather than added value, innovation, and also supply chain and sustainability practices. And the approach of focusing on cost really just puts pressure on suppliers in terms of where can they deliver the best cost saving. So it doesn't focus on these other areas which can actually save money and save time for a buyer in the long run. They just focus very much on that short-term procurement aspect. So that's one key aspect that we used to see. Thankfully, that has changed now. And actually it's transformed because of the work that we've done and supply partners that we've worked with and others in the industry to say, if we move to a longer term contracting model, that can actually deliver a number of benefits for the value chain to invest in resources, to invest in people, technology and solutions. So again, the move away from focus on cost alone through e-auctions to actually looking more at adding value within the supply chain and enhancing procurement practices has really helped the supply chain. What we're also now starting to see for the first time is multi-year contracts with customers. So again, on canned tomatoes, we have multi-year contracts with some of our retailers, which means that we can also offer multi-year 3-year contracts with our growers on the ground. And that's not just at tier 1, that's at tier 3, 4 and 5 within the value chain. And the feedback that we receive from suppliers and growers and farmers is that really offers that certainty of supply, certainty of ability to invest in a time when it's really difficult. And we know that the food price system is being squeezed all of the time, and there's growing population pressures and other pressures around water stewardship and various other things in the food sector. So that security and stability offers the investment opportunity for growers, which they really welcome. I guess there are some other examples that we see in terms of where suppliers don't have sustainability KPIs, key performance indicators or objectives. And therefore, when we think around the sort of the annual review and cycle of discussing performance with suppliers, if sustainability isn't built in, it's not going to be very high on their agenda. So what we've tried to do at Princes is to build sustainability objectives and key performance indicators with every single supplier that we work with. So they're really aware in terms of why we are doing this, how we are working with them, but also we hope that they translate that within their value chain. So the message comes from us, it then filters down in terms of their lower tiers within the value chain. And all of a sudden you've got this, I guess, the massive demand to say, here's some of the examples of where we are leading and improving from a sustainability perspective. So that's really beneficial as well.
Cool, thanks so much. I think those are really substantive and clear examples. And I think it's really interesting what you highlighted in terms of the connectivity between how you work with retailers and how you are able to support suppliers and forge those long-term relationships with suppliers. That's great. They sound like quite important business changes there, and I imagine that there's needed to be engagement with your leadership team to take some of this work forward. And I just wondered if you could speak to how engagement with your leadership team has been important to this work on procurement practices.
It's been critical, Andy, I have to say, because if you don't get the message from the top, how on earth are you going to filter that down in terms of the procurement teams? And you know, we've seen a number of challenges around cost price inflation pressures, sourcing pressures, whether that's, you know, moving away from certain countries and regions. And again, that all adds a level of complexity, a level of uncertainty from the supply chain. But this is where, for me, the purpose-led organisation really stands out and says, we are not going to source product from Xinjiang region in China when we know that there are defined human rights risks or due diligence, lack of transparency that we can't control. So taking those important decisions may have a short-term commercial implication, and it certainly did for Princes, but the leadership of the board to say, no, this is the right thing to do, it aligns with our values and our vision and our mission, is really powerful. And I think without that sort of top-line leadership and position to be able to take to the business, we really couldn't deliver the sustainability objectives that we have in place. I think the other thing that we are starting to recognise from the leadership level is, you know, this is fundamental, and it's not just a nice to do from a values perspective, but actually there are cost benefits analysis that are being undertaken, which say actually the cost of investing in value chains to work with growers on a longer term basis is having value. And that is adding a reduction in the cost prices overall in certain commodities. So again, moving to that longer term pricing structure with our growers or with our key supply partners means that we've got a bit more resilience within the supply chain. We've got a bit more business continuity and certainty that we have with supply partners, whereas I guess that's sort of the old traditional approach of a transactional 6-month, 12-month tender process doesn't foster that supply relationship and collaboration that you need. And I think the board is starting to see the benefits as well of the open dialogue, the open conversations that we have with suppliers, where we do have a longer term contract to say, let's have that frank, open and honest discussion with us. Tell us what are your problems, what are the issues and the opportunities, and that we can help you to basically improve the value chain overall.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Paul. And so just to finish off here, if you had any advice for any businesses seeking to embed human rights, labour standards within their procurement function. What would that advice be?
I think the key one is don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. So nobody has all of the answers. Nobody is absolutely at where they want to be in every single value chain, given the size, scale, and complexity of the organizations. So I think it's just about prioritizing what is it that you really fundamentally want to improve or change within your procurement function. And that could be as simple as starting the process of making sure that sustainability, key performance indicators, objectives are set for procurement teams. That might be establishing a working group or committee where you can feed in the insights and experience from the procurement team so that you're aware that the sustainability agenda really aligns with the procurement agenda and that you're offering that sort of the synergy of benefits. I think there's a few other initiatives as well. So the things around training that sustainability teams can offer to the procurement. Again, one of my frustrations early on was it seemed as if within the industry we were in separate echo chambers. So the sustainability teams in one, procurement in another. And actually, if you can break down those barriers and talk together as openly and honestly as you can on a regular basis, that's when with supply partners and procurement teams you can try and solve and tackle some of these issues. There are other initiatives, so I think training and engagement. So we have launched within Princes since 2020 the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply Ethics mark. Again, that's really a signal of intent to our supply base in terms of how important our procurement team takes sustainability. But it also offers the buying team, another notch on their belt in terms of an external training provider so that they can talk with confidence about some of the issues. And I think as well, when we ask our procurement teams to lead on this, we're not looking for them to be human rights experts or sustainability practitioners. All we're looking for them to do is ask the right questions, to use their eyes and ears when they're visiting suppliers, to bring some of those insights to life. And even just adding sustainability onto the agenda of strategic meetings with suppliers, again, is just a bit of a drip feed in terms of the importance that the organisation gives on this topic, which is really powerful.
Well, thank you so much for those incredibly useful insights. Really appreciate your time today. And I'm now going to hand back to Garrett to take you through the next bit of the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy and Paul, for that recording. It's great to see how the procurement is really the heart of the solution for the sustainability goals and how leadership is really bought in and supporting the alignment of those two teams. So before we get into question and answer, I do want to remind you of the 4 recommendations that we discussed during this webinar. We will drop these into the chat so you can copy them into your notes, but work with leadership to get responsible sourcing embedded in the procurement process, assess those purchasing practices, provide training and upskilling for directors and procurement team, and keep procurement in the loop. And it was great to hear from Princes because I think it really echoes a lot of those recommendations and how they've been implemented. So following the webinar, there's some actions you can take immediately following. So we'll circulate that one pager, so keep your eyes out for that one pager and the recording link. So please share those with your colleagues and with supply chain partners. Also, again, this is part of a series, so please go check out those other recordings as well. If you have a little more time, start mapping out and identifying the key decision holders that can support operationalizing human rights due diligence findings and those procurement decisions, or outline how your procurement team and responsible sourcing teams are currently operating, and maybe try to prioritize a few ways to improve that coordination. And finally, work with a consultant to develop a strategy to improve human rights due diligence, the process, and identify how it can be embedded across the organization. And remember, Fishwise is here and always willing to have a conversation and share those resources and support. You can also sign up for the Fishwise and Rise newsletter to stay up to date with human rights topics. So with that, let's move into the question and answer. Another big thank you to our speakers and Marsha Dickson for staying on for the question and answer. I know we are very excited to pepper with you a few questions. So thank you for being here. So, you know, I think we heard we heard in the video with Paul from Prince's group. What are some of the first steps you recommend a company to take to bring purchasing and responsible sourcing closer together?
Thank you. Boy, and bravo, Paul. That's such a good explanation of the value of talking with your suppliers and engaging with them more deeply and understanding how your purchasing practices impact them. I was just so thrilled with what he had to say. Wish he was here on Q&A as well. You know, it's interesting because first steps are interesting. I know your recommendations say get that senior leadership buy-in, but we've actually had experience where sometimes data is a first step that helps get that leadership buy-in. I remember one of our subscribers saying, you know, we'd always heard, you know, from a few suppliers about these problems, and we kind of knew that they were problems, but now we have data and we can talk about a significant portion of our suppliers talking about a particular thing we do that creates challenges. So that allowed them to have new, you know, more fruitful conversations within the company. So if you don't have the leverage and the ability to persuade your senior leadership right now, get some data, because that will help them. Because when they see that there are problems in the supply chains and the risks that are being created there and the vulnerability of the supply chain, that can help with action. Then the question is, what do you do with the data when you get it? And I encourage data, you know, before you start planning what you're going to do, because each company has somewhat different pressures it puts on the supply chain. And so you can have an idea from, you know, general industry knowledge what's probably happening, but it's really helpful to know precisely what's happening in your company. You know, we do a lot of industry reporting where we take all the data, you know, for every company that we have assessments on. We talk about trends and we talk about, you know, significant things that are happening, but behind the scenes, when we look at the specific company reports, there can be quite a difference in how they're behaving. And, you know, one company may need to focus much more quickly and urgently on one area versus another that you wouldn't see if you're looking at industry averages. So I think, you know, again, getting data early is so valuable to guide the efforts, to persuade upper management and things like that. And then engage your company. Some of the best things we've seen happen is, you know, we're often going through the CSR door, the sustainability door. You know, those people, you people often are a bit in a silo, you know, maybe even devalued a little. Here's the business, we're making money, and here are you guys. And, you know, sometimes there's a difficulty in thinking, how do we action this data and really get the company moving? Well, bring it into the company, help them with that. You know, we've seen our subscribers start forming working groups, cross-functional working groups, say, here's a topic that we've you know, scored fairly poorly in forecasting. What could we do differently? Get together and think about what could we do differently. Also engage with the open-ended content that our reports provide, because the suppliers, we don't just want to identify problems. We want to identify things to change and how you can change them. And the suppliers are in a place to give really valuable insights because, you know, they serve many customers. And so they can see what works well, they can see what doesn't work well, and they are really good at providing suggestions. We had a company, a very simple situation, had a lot of their suppliers were reporting late payments. It was way more than the industry benchmark. Way more of their suppliers were reporting late payments, and they were really late. You looked in the supplier open-ended comments, and we realized that it was a process issue. You know, that they had a practice of accumulating invoices, though I know a lot of companies do. And ultimately, that worked is 9 out of 10 of those invoices were significantly late, you know, beyond the contractual agreed payment date. So, you know, that's an example of something that could be pretty easily brought into your accounting and finance and say, hey, you know, we have a problem here. This is creating cash flow issues. It's probably impacting worker wages and their wage payments and things like that. But it is interesting too. We ask in our Better Buying Purchasing Practices Index, what, from a supplier point of view, what should be the priority? And I thought when we started asking that question, they would point to some of those low-hanging fruit items. They went right to the guts. They went right to the forecasting, because planning and forecasting, you know, having, for a supplier, having an understanding of what kind of business to expect from you during the year, what that's going to look like, what you're going to want, is so critical and touches everything else. It touches the costs of doing business. It touches the efficiencies of doing business. It touches their profitability. It touches their ability to have the right workforce in place and to be able to pay them. You know, so they're asking for some of the most difficult things to be tackled. And interestingly, our subscribers are right on the occasion, and you know, they are improving year over year. You know, sometimes just
Oh, Marsha, we lost you for a little bit. If maybe you just turn off your video, maybe your audio will work better.
wonder, when did you lose me, and what look did I have on my face? Which is
no, it's a great look. If you could just go back a few sentences.
I'm on free flow. I don't remember the sentences I was on, but you know, I think what we were talking about, I gave the example of the payment situation, and then, but the fact is that when we ask suppliers what their customers should be working on, what's the highest priority, if it's often the planning and forecasting, it's often the, you know, and that everybody says, wow, that's really difficult. But there are things that can be done that help the supplier understand what's coming, plan for what's coming, so that they can be, you know, they can be more profitable business, so that they can give you the best cost, so that they can be fair with their workers, so they can have the right workforce in place. But that is such a critical piece of the business relationship, and it touches so many elements that they're asking for the hard stuff right off the bat. And the companies that are subscribing with us are showing year over year improvement on that, because we break down planning and forecasting into different elements that they can see, well, you know, this is going to be really hard to do, but we can do this for sure, and that'll help. So I think that answers your question.
No, that's wonderful. And it's great to hear too about how you guys also break down that forecasting to be able to help unpack that a little bit more and understand, you know, where those areas of improvements are. But I do want to also open it up to see if, you know, Andy, do you have any questions that you would like to ask?
Thanks, Garrett, and Marsha, thank you so much for participating today and for those insights. All of these webinars have been important, but I do genuinely feel that today's is particularly important because I think it's arguably the area that we as a sector have most work to do. And actually looking at the responses to the survey that Garrett shared at the beginning of the webinar, I think there's a kind of widespread view that purchasing practices needs to be a key focus. And I was really interested, Marsha, to hear what you said about the potential to adapt your resources for use in our sector. And I just wondered how complex and time consuming that process would be.
Yeah, you know, we built our existing tools on an awful lot of research with suppliers, because we didn't want to build tools that didn't ask the questions that mattered most, you know, didn't ask about the practices that had the most impact on their business and their ability to provide good working conditions. This was really meant to elevate that voice and the concerns of suppliers. So we did spend a lot of time building that, and we decided we built it to be as streamlined as possible, because the last thing anybody needs is another 200 plus item survey. You know, so we have the purchasing practices index is about 50 items. It goes into the objective business details of that relationship, you know, what actually happened. And then the partnership index is 12 questions, and it's a high level, does this happen all the time or never? And so I think the partnership index is closest to ready because it takes a step back from the details and is more generic in looking at, where are you along the lines of getting toward the 5 principles. And so I think, what I would like to see happen is a handful of leading buyers who would like to investigate this, take a look at those surveys with us. Let us access some of your suppliers to let them look at it, and let's see what kind of tweaks we need. I think we could go pretty quickly with the partnership index, and then the detailed index might take a little bit more. We do have some conversations going with a potential funder to support some of that R&D, but I think we can, we spent a lot of time with that in the initial creation. I think we can streamline that a lot now, especially with we would require supplier input for sure, and buyer input would be valuable too. So I don't think it would take that long, and I would like to get started. Princess, Paul should step up. I'd love for them to come in and help us with this, and let us access a few suppliers and talk to them too.
Great, thanks, Marsha. And I'm sure Paul will be interested to speak to you. And I know that there's other companies within our membership. So there's 31 companies that are part of the Sea Alliance, and we'd be certainly interested to talk to them about the work that you're doing and any opportunities to collaborate. So I think that's great. And then the other thing I just wondered was the extent to which it's possible to assess the extent to which changes in purchasing practices are leading to direct impact on workers. And just to ask this question, I give a bit of an anecdote. When I worked in a retailer, I remember very clearly a conversation with a buyer where I was talking about the cost of goods in a certain supply chain, and some discussions that were being had at an industry level about the cost of goods not being sufficient to cover the costs of sustainably producing that product. And the buyer anecdotally mentioned the fact that the supplier of that product had recently arrived to meet him and had traveled in a private jet, was wearing a really expensive watch. And his point was, how am I going to ensure that my higher cost of goods that I'm going to pay is going to directly translate to impact for workers on the ground? And I just wondered what thoughts you had on that.
Yeah, I really dislike that example when I hear it. But whatever, I know it comes up. But look, there are a lot of initiatives and entities looking at the relationship between the supplier and its workers, and auditing that. I assume this happens in the seafood industry too. I assume there are some sort of audits perhaps to make sure that what needs to happen is happening. The problem is that we're addressing is that the business relationship between that buyer and the supplier is not fundamentally sound. One, we don't expect a supplier to forego profits to pay workers. They should be able to have a profit and do everything that the suppliers ask. So we ask in our survey, we don't get into the specific details of pricing. Nobody would want to share that with us, but we do ask a question about what % of the orders from this buyer covered the costs of what we call compliant production. And that means basically covers all the costs of the things everything you've asked for, and allows the company to have a profit because they should. They need that to invest in the longer term improvements and efficiencies that'll save you money in the future and help you achieve broader sustainability goals. But when they say less than 100% are priced to cover all those costs, which is almost always, I think it's more like 60%. Then we ask the question about, what % of the orders actually cover the direct costs, the cost of labor, the cost of the materials, if that's relevant to this, and that's also surprisingly low. So right there that the supplier is being forced to choose what to cut and where to cut corners. And that's not a position, that you want to put the supplier in. You need to have a financially sustainable relationship with your suppliers. The correlation between a supplier's purchasing practices that impact a supplier's business, financially, et cetera, operationally, and the correlation between purchasing practices that impact workplace conditions and workers are highly and significantly correlated. You cannot expect a supplier to pass on good benefits to workers without being sound themselves first. We ask in our questionnaire, we don't ask impacts on everything, but we ask in a couple key places about impacts on workers, on the environment, on business. And those two key places in our Better Buying Purchasing Practices Index are with the monthly order production, the volume shipped, which basically is a measure of how unstable or stable that relationship is over the year. And we ask about the impacts of that, on workers. And a lot of times that's related to, of course, excessive overtime, failure to pay wages and full benefits, the instability of the business across the year is related kind of ebb and flow of workers, where you have to have workers, all of a sudden a whole lot more workers for a peak period, and then you have to have a whole lot fewer workers in that, precarious work that we see that's not, not very well protected and has unsafe conditions. So we see those things all, and then we see all the business impacts where this is higher cost, this is lower efficiency, but lower productivity. We're losing our best workers, our worker turnover is going, which impacts your quality. And so, there's just so many across the board impacts. That's one place we measure the impacts. Another place is where we measure what we call kind of an internal consistency, and is the business speaking with one voice. And a good example is we see a compliance person, really pushing on a supplier to lower its working hours. But at the same time, a sourcing a procurement person saying, I don't care what you have to do, get it here on time or else, so that, again, we measure the impacts of that. And it's often related to the time and the financial pressures that impact, again, business, it impacts workers, and it even impacts environmental initiatives.
Marsha, thanks so much. I think some of those examples will really resonate with those watching this webinar, and we would really be keen to continue the conversations with you, if that's okay, just to explore what might be possible and how we could work together.
Please. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think this is the start of some great collaboration and some great conversations moving forward with for the seafood industry. So thank you so much. I do want to be cognizant and respectful of everyone's time. So we're coming close to the end. But again, I want to say, check out the previous recordings. It's been an absolute pleasure to learn and share with you. So thank you for the opportunity. And I will pass it over to Andy for some closing remarks.
Thanks so much, Garrett. Yeah, just a really big thank you to everyone that's contributed to the 6 webinars that we've run as part of the Anchoring Due Diligence webinar series. I think it's been incredibly informative. As you know, this is a key piece of work within our strategy. You can see our strategy there on the slide, which is focused on improving the human rights due diligence that companies do in their supply chain, using our influence to advocate for the right regulation and enforcement by governments and other international bodies. And then, as you know, we've also got our Change on the Water Fund, which is a fund which supports improvement work at fishery or aquaculture farm level that we can identify directly improves human rights and labour standards. So there's some exciting upcoming announcements from us. We hope to be able to open new rounds of funding for our Change on the Water Fund that we'll be announcing in due course. Next week, we're going to be doing an outreach to governments about the ILO Work in Fishing Convention that will aim to follow up with further more bespoke advocacy by our companies to governments on that key convention. And then crucially, we are also going to announce that we as a group are going to be working on a set of commitments for seafood businesses and retailers that really define very time-bound, specific, measurable actions that we want to see companies take on human rights and labour standards in the supply chain. So very much looking forward to engaging with everyone going forward. The webinar series is a starting point in many ways rather than a destination. There's an incredible amount of work to do going forwards. And really, I just wanted to finish off by saying a huge thank you to Garrett, Erin and the Fishwise team who have run this webinar series very successfully, and huge thanks for all that you've invested in this. Thanks to World Benchmarking Alliance and Global Tuna Alliance that came with us on the journey and partnered with us on developing this content. And please pick up with us directly if you see any opportunities for us to work together on anything relating to this area. So thank you very much, everyone. And Garrett, shall I